welcome back to another episode of Masked Monologues. Today I have with me Shay Leonia. Sorry,
Leonia, yes.
Leonia. Shay Leonia, and she is a musician. Can you
Yes.
please introduce yourself? Tell us about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a professional recording artist, professional singer, and I also have a company of my own helping independent musicians to navigate their careers and create a music career on their own terms. And most recently in 2022, I launched the Millennial Musician Podcast, which does much of the same thing. And I'm on a mission to keep independent musicians from being so discouraged by the industry that they end up quitting.
Yes. No, it's definitely a competitive industry and it's hard through all the clutter, especially for independent artists. Can you tell us about some of the services you offer and what exactly you do for musicians?
Sure. So with my company, 44th Minute Media, I've been able to offer done for you services such as writing people's bios, getting them set up for their EPK, auditing their websites, helping them with booking, with drafting up copies on how to network with podcasters or with bloggers, et cetera. But what I really have enjoyed doing is coming at it from more of the coach standpoint,
Mhm.
where I'm able to actually work with them and collaborate with them on what feels like the best marketing direction for them. Because the done for you services, while it's something that's practical that you can get done really quickly by outsourcing for someone else to do, it's discouraging to know that once that project ends, that musician still doesn't necessarily know how to do those things for themselves. So that's
Yes.
why I particularly enjoy working in a collaboration sense.
So you mainly focus on marketing and coaching for independent artists, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so with the marketing and the coaching, can you tell me, say I was just an independent artist starting out and maybe I was thinking of releasing an album. I didn't have any connections, I didn't know anybody. How would you approach this situation? How would you help someone out with that? And what would be your tips, your tricks, and advice?
That's a loaded question. So the first place I would start is if you're an absolutely brand new musician, let's go to the far extreme and
Hmm.
say you woke up yesterday with a song in your heart and you said, "Hey, I want to be a musician now."
Yes.
The last thing that I would advise for you to do is to release an album. And that might sound counterintuitive, but the reason why is because if no one knows you, you need to be able to start what I would consider a drip campaign of sorts. And so you want to create music, yes, but you're going to be doing it in more of a market research type of way because what's going to happen inevitably is two things. One, you are going to be releasing music to people who are still learning who you are and
Mhm.
are going to provide you enough grace for you to make enough missteps for you to start to fine tune. And that's the best way to get better is to just put yourself out there and make the mistakes
Mhm.
loudly and proudly. But the other thing that's going to happen is that a few months from now, the music that you're putting out to your soon to be fans, we hope, you're going to start hating that music. You're going to feel so cringe about it. And that's a good thing. And that's because you're growing, you're starting to fine tune what your sound is. I would be absolutely mortified if anyone came across any of my first recordings. So
Mhm.
to commit yourself to an album off the bat is part of what I think is damaged about the advice that's given in this industry is that
Yes.
so many indie musicians are told that all of the advice that's out there for them is for them. And that's not the case. You have to really gauge with a realistic lens, where are you at today and how can you really make the needle move for
Mhm.
where you're at?
And let's say, like the situation you described, woke up today and you said, "Hey, I want to be a musician. I want to make money off of my music." Would you suggest maybe starting an Instagram account, maybe starting a TikTok, and then doing little shorts or snippets of songs before releasing singles or releasing that album? Would that be a good way to go?
I'm moving away from the whole album thing. Like I wouldn't even approach it necessarily as a single thing. I would release them as singles, but I would probably present them more as rough demos and be honest with your audience because your first fans are going to start off being your friends and family, which technically aren't going to be your fans. They're going to be more of your supporters because they
Yes.
love you. So they're who you need in order to start off, but they're not going to be ultimately who you want
Mm.
in the room. But to go back to your question as far as how to incorporate social media, absolutely grab the social media handles relevant for your account, I would steer clear of anything that people are going to laugh at, such as like if nobody knew who I was, I wouldn't choose official Shay Leonia because you don't have any competitors out there. So stop it. But what I would do is I would make sure I grab Shay Leonia on all of the platforms that I can so that at least I own it. And I would just start experimenting. Let these platforms be a playground. It should never be approached as something like, oh, I haven't posted in a while. It's getting a little dusty. Time to throw something up there. Just really find out what inspires you. And that's, I think, new musicians and new artists in general they get so discouraged about the brand newness phase. But that's the best place to be because you can play so freely and you
Mhm.
have very little audience or eyes on you about what you're doing. So you can make mistakes. You can mess up. You can try and experiment different things and you can really have that vulnerability with your audience. And out of those friends and family that are starting you from the onset, the ones that stick around for the long haul are going to be the ones that are going to be so endlessly proud of you because they remember how you started off. So
Mhm.
look at it as an advantage and not a disadvantage.
Yes. And I want to go back to the competitive nature of the music industry. Would you say that music industry is more competitive now, or how would you stand out as an artist?
I'm not sure that I don't like to consider it as being competitive. I honestly don't see it as competitive at all. And the reason why is because, not to sound cliche, but you're really just competing against yourself. And no matter how many times you might have heard a certain message, I think about a breakup playlist. I might know that I really want to hear Mariah Carey sing Butterfly because that's such a great breakup song to just bring out the tears. But I'm not going to hear that song on repeat 24/7. I might want to add in some other songs that I could listen to. I might want to hear a little bit of a Boys to Men doing just fine. I might
Yes.
want to hear some other stuff, some new songs. And so there are going to be so many different spices that you want in your spice rack, in your
Mhm.
flavor palette sonically, that I don't think that there's any beneficial energy spent towards considering it as being competitive.
Yes. And I'm wondering, you say that once you're starting out, it's a wonderful space to do a lot of experimenting, a lot of
Hmm.
testing, put yourself out there, delve into things that you might not be inclined to do. And I'm wondering, as you progress as an artist, should you find that niche and should you stick to it? Because nowadays, a lot of the major artists are switching from one genre to the next genre and they're mixing genres. So I'm wondering, as an indie artist, you have to define yourself in a space before you're able to branch out.
I had an excellent conversation with the legendary Booty Brown from The Far Side, actually came on my podcast, and we discussed this for a little bit about genre and what the clear line looks like, and if there even is a clear line anymore, because The Far Side is a legendary hip hop group from Los Angeles,
Mhm.
but they were very different in the sense that they were getting put on bills with Korn and with Slipknot and just hard rock acts and they were seen as alternative hip hop. And they never called themselves alternative hip hop. But now you fast forward to these days when Booty Brown of the Far Side is collaborating with. And so I think one of the first points that he made that I think stands really true is you're not going to necessarily be able to classify yourself in terms of genre. It's going to be anointed on you. Other people are going to decide for you what you sound like. And again, it's yet another one of those things where I don't think you are going to be spending any useful time trying to figure that out. But also, in terms of niching down from the branding perspective, I think that you are best suited defining who you are and what your values are as your niche, not your sound, because you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time to play. One of my favorite artists, Kelsey Warren of Black Emoji, he does this seamlessly where he has this common through line of electronic music, but he will dabble any which way along the spectrum of sounds. And he's never going to want to be pigeonholed into one type of box, but still somehow you can still tell that it's him. And
Mhm.
I think that's a favor we can all do ourselves is giving ourselves enough room to play while letting ourselves be the niche.
Yeah. And you said that as an artist, especially an indie artist, you have to create a brand for yourself. And you're saying that brand should be based off of your values, maybe the personality, who you are. How
Mhm.
would an artist go about just being insightful, looking internally, and finding those values, finding who they want to be? Should they look to artists they enjoy as a inspiration, or should they look to their lives? How could you discover your brand?
Absolutely. I think that it's really helpful to look at the artists that have inspired your sound, getting really specific with yourself. Okay, for me, for instance, I'm a huge Janet Jackson fan. But if I'm looking at Janet Jackson as an inspiration, I want to find out, okay, what is it about Janet Jackson that I am drawn to? Okay, first of all, we have a very similar way of stacking harmonies. I can only dream of though. Like I'm still working on getting nearly as good as she is at the harmony piece. But arranging harmonies is very similar. We have a very similar style of not being necessarily powerhouse vocalists. We have a very similar compulsion to talk about societal issues while also talking about things that might be sexier or more mature. We have all of those things in common. And then I look at like the philanthropy aspect of somebody like George Michael, or the fact that I
Yes.
really admire his vocal delivery. And you start to really piece together the things that maybe if it's not as easy for you to look at what you do or
Mhm.
what you are drawn to, finding out what you're not drawn to. Right now, one of the artists that I wouldn't want to go near with a 10-foot pole is Kanye West. I don't like anything that he stands for anymore, which
Mhm.
is so heartbreaking because when I was in college, he was the biggest deal. But finding out what you're not into. It's very similar to coming up with a dating profile for yourself. Who you absolutely not want. Do you not want to match with anybody that's under 5'5"? Make sure you figure that out for yourself, but as a
Mhm.
person and as an artist.
Yes. And I just want to go back to you saying about you were talking about West, and I'm wondering a lot of people nowadays, it depends on your personality, your how charismatic you are, your values, what you stand for. And from there, people will look at the artist and say, you know what, this artist likes X, Y, and Z. I really like X, Y, and Z. Therefore, I'll go check them out and listen to their music. And that can be a barrier separation, especially if that artist is producing good music and you don't necessarily like their values or what they're into. So, how big of a factor, how large of a component would that entire storytelling aspect, who you are, come be when it comes to your music and how many people stream it, how many people listen to it? Because obviously there's a lot of controversial artists out there,
Mhm.
and if you analyze their music from a objective standpoint, their music might be top notch, but you might be hesitant or reluctant to listen to it because your values don't align. How could you be more universally applicable? Because the major artists out there, a lot of people resonate with them, and it's because of that story, who they are. And I'm just wondering how you'd separate the two or how that works.
I think that's a really thoughtful question. And I think that going in the direction of becoming more universal, or what I'll say is more palatable for more
Mhm.
people, is the worst thing that you can do for yourself. I think that if you're just starting out, again, count your values and count your viewpoints on things as part of the experimentation of A/B testing. Do I feel comfortable saying this thing? You always want to make sure that if you are sharing these things, that you're sharing your scars and not your wounds. But for me personally, as a fan and as a music creator, I think it's really important to draw a line in the sand, especially on important topics, because you want to make sure that the people that are for you are the people that are for you.
Yes.
And I, like, for instance, right now, I have always been a very moderate fan of Macklemore and Kalani. But I got to tell you, once I started hearing how vocal they were being about Palestine and SZA, I stepped my fandom up. I was like, you know what? I want to support them even more now because I
Yes.
love the fact that they're speaking out when so many people are afraid to. But then there are other issues where it's like sexual assaults that happen
Mhm.
constantly. And it's almost too many to keep up with, to the point where at times it feels like I wouldn't have anything left to listen to because we live in a patriarchal society. And unfortunately, some of our favorite artists have very legitimate accusations against them
Yes.
for either sexual assault or domestic violence against women. And so I have, unfortunately, this was another conversation I had on my podcast with Sean Taro, who wrote a book about Takashi 69. And it was so nauseating for me to read his book while understanding that he wasn't necessarily promoting what Takashi had done, but unfortunately, this is somebody who has a massive fan base and people are influenced by
Yep.
this type of behavior. So I think it's something that I feel that people have the right to make their own decisions around in
Mhm.
terms of listenership, but I also think that you get to decide for yourself as a musician what you feel comfortable speaking out on
Mm.
and not. Although I will encourage every musician right now to speak out on Palestine. But yeah, I think that you have to decide that for yourself and just allow the people that want to know these things about you to get closer to you and to learn them.
Yes. No, I completely agree with that. I want to know when you're coaching artists or you're working on mindset, how do you separate your music and your artist identity from your personal life? Because obviously, as an artist, you're putting your life out on the line. You're
Mhm.
giving up yourself to your audience, to your fan base, and that can have mental repercussions. You can end up suicidal like a lot of musicians have been, or just mental health issues, depressed, anxiety. And so I'm wondering, how do you look at it from a business standpoint in order to protect yourself? Or just how would you go about every comment on your Instagram page or every comment on TikTok or everybody who says, "Oh, I hate this. You look terrible in that photo," whatever comments that you get, all the hate that you've been given, and just balance it out with, this is what I love doing, this is why I'm doing this, and the music is what I'm doing it all for.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that I'm a huge advocate for therapy. I want to take a moment to just plug Backline right now, which is backline.care. If you go to that website, they will match you with a therapist that is within your price point in your region. If you are touring and you can't qualify for a therapist, they will assign you with a life coach that doesn't have any restrictions on their licensure. So that way you can continue to get support. But I absolutely encourage everyone, whether you're a musician or not, to be in therapy because we're all dealing with for the very first time, social media. And I think that I have such an advantage and I'm so grateful that I was born when I was because I got to grow up without social media and it didn't come about until I was an adult. And so it wasn't the norm for me. And unfortunately, that's something that Gen Zers don't get to experience what it was like to grow up without having to have your life be at scale for the masses. And so I think that it's important to give yourself permission and to give yourself, and it's even more important to give yourself boundaries. And sometimes your boundaries and permission can be the same thing. I think that if you feel like you are getting a barrage of hate on a certain video, delete the video. It's going to be way better for your mental health if you do not have the tenacity to be able to read constant comments and input from people that is just negative that actually causes so much damage to your brain and to the
Mhm.
neural pathways that are built and it can really take a toll and you don't want to try to prove to yourself that you're stronger than you are. It's going to be even stronger for yourself to admit I can't take this right now. And that's happened to me before on TikTok. I've said something that was misunderstood and suddenly I just got
Yes.
a whole load of comments and I was like, damn it, this is not the video I wanted to go
Mhm.
viral. But of course, like everybody just started piling on top of me. So instead of making any follow up videos or acting like I could handle it, oh,
Mhm.
I can take a digital punch here and there. No, I deleted the video. I was like, it's not worth my mental health. So
Yes.
I think figuring out what those boundaries are going to be for you. A boundary could be an example of I'm never going to read a comment. It's going to be a pretty unrealistic boundary, but I'm more power to you. But another boundary could just be giving yourself that permission to not post or to delete a post or to make an apology or to reach out to friends, people that you know love you and don't judge you and say, hey, I just want an objective view from somebody that knows my heart. Do you think that I said anything wrong here? Could I get your feedback on something in a loving way?
Yes. I want to diverge or distance away from the whole mindset and the mentality and step back into the marketing and the business aspect of being an independent musician. Once you get started, because we were talking about the situation where you wake up one day and you decide to be a musician, how do you make your music profitable? How do you make a living off of your music? Because that can be difficult to do if you don't start off with a lot of connections, networking, a lot of resources. Maybe you don't have a large following on social media and you don't know that many people. How would you approach that?
So first of all, you're going to have to look at what you're investing versus what your return on investment is. And unfortunately, it's going to be very lopsided in the beginning. What I would recommend all new artists do, especially as they're building their fan base, is instead of putting your music directly on what we call the DSPs, the digital streaming platforms, you're going to want to instead put your music on Bandcamp. And Bandcamp is incredibly supportive. They have Bandcamp Fridays where you get 100% of the profits. I believe it's the first Friday of each month. And also they have a pay what you like model, which I am a huge fan of because one of my best fans, Mark McLaughlin, he has talked about like people will charge $20 for their album on Bandcamp, but
Hmm.
he'll purchase it for $40 just to show support. So I think getting your music on Bandcamp, extremely important.
Yes.
The next thing I would say is start coming up with different ideas for merch that's not going to put you out. And one of the
Hmm.
best ideas I can tell you, as especially if you don't have a fan base yet, is posters. Coming up with posters is a huge profit margin where you spend very little money to produce it, but it is a limited edition, one of a time, one time souvenir that
Yes.
somebody will only be able to get at your show that night.
Hmm.
And you can make money off of that as well. I think the idea of I'm going to make money off of my music is just this floating little cloud that people don't really understand the mechanics of anymore. And so
Yes.
if they did, they would understand that even the most profitable artists right now are not necessarily making money off their music. They're making money off of touring and ticket
Hmm.
sales. And that's a whole other can of worms with what's going on with Live Nation. But yeah, I would say to just supplement your income in other ways that are adjacent to music.
Yes. And I'm wondering, how would you find connections or find a network once you're growing as an artist? Say, maybe you need a manager, or maybe you need someone to book you for tours, maybe you need somebody to manage your merchandise or whatever aspects of your business that you cannot handle yourself or you don't have the expertise in. How would you go about acquiring those people?
Don't. That's my answer there. Do not. You don't need any of those people. I promise you don't. You don't need a
No.
manager. Nope, not at all. You don't need a manager. You don't need a booking agent. I'll tell you right now, Lydia Caesar is a full-time musician. She has, gosh, maybe at this point, I haven't checked in a while, but maybe at 200,000 followers on Instagram. I think she's got to be up around the same amount on TikTok. Her husband is a full-time audio engineer and YouTuber, and she does not have a manager.
So
You
she
don't need these things.
does everything herself then?
She does everything herself and she's a mother of 3. If she can do it, you can do it. I swear this is probably one of my biggest gripes ever is that I see musicians constantly thinking that they need to hire a team too prematurely. And that's the biggest way to blow your budget. And that's the biggest way to I'll say this because I'm sure that there are going to be people listening to me being like, what? I know somebody that
Mhm.
hired somebody to get them on playlists and suddenly their streams went up to hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know what happened the moment that they stopped working together? Because you only get those campaigns for as long as you're paying for them. So let's say that I hire somebody to promote my single for 6 weeks and they get me on a bunch of playlists. As soon as our campaign is finished, those plays on that platform are going to dwindle down back to maybe a few hundred.
Yes.
And so now I've just thrown my money into the ether.
Mm.
And the worst part about it is that because I got those plays on Spotify, I don't have any of the data to be able to follow up with those fans now. So those fans are in the abyss. I just have
Mhm.
to trust that the universe will return them to me when it comes time for me to release another single. Now,
Yes.
there are people that have disposable income that can absolutely throw their money to hire and outsource for all of these things, but that
Mhm.
does not need to be your story. You can instead invest your time in the correct ways, which is fostering the relationships. And I know nobody wants to hear that because
Mhm.
it is a longer game, but it is the most fruitful game. And you have to really get real with yourself. Do you want to have a trendy, microwavable TV dinner style career, in which case, by all means, throw your money at it? Or do you want to have a gourmet legacy that you're leaving behind with your music that's actually impacting people?
Yes. And I want to just ask a little question about not hiring any help. If you
Mhm.
are someone who has gotten to a stage like you were saying, she's a single mom, or she's a mom of 3 kids, sorry, and her husband's an audio engineer and she runs this entire platform. would she ever outsource to freelancers, say if she needed help on some marketing campaigns, or would you suggest that as a good alternative for anybody who doesn't want to hire a manager but maybe doesn't have the time to do everything themselves?
Yeah, so here's the difference here. I would never hire a manager or a booking agent or anything like that prematurely. What I would do is I would figure out, okay, do I need a certain task? Do I need somebody to go around making sure that my posters are hung up in wherever places are hanging posters
Yes.
at? I need to make sure that I have a photographer to do a new brand campaign for what I have coming up? Do I need to make sure I have a video for this upcoming event? Do I
Mhm.
have content? Things like that. But even those things, you can still bargain hunt if you are a brand new artist. You don't need to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a videographer. You
Mhm.
can find somebody that's a student or somebody that just got a new lens for their camera that they want to test out, and you can barter with them. There are so many more economic ways of doing these things and so many other things that you need to prioritize over just spraying and praying your name everywhere.
Right.
Because if you don't know how to do these things, again, you're just throwing your money in the garbage.
Yes. And I would like to wrap up this episode now. So if you'd like to shout out to your podcast, any of your social media platforms, where can people find you and stream your podcast episodes or just check out what you do?
Yeah, so you can feel free to listen to the Millennial Musician Podcast. I put out new episodes each week. And again, I am on a mission to keep indie musicians from being so discouraged by the massive amount of misinformation that
Mhm.
exists out there. So please make sure you tune into that podcast. If you aren't a musician yourself, please share it with somebody that is, because I'm sure that they need it. And if you'd like to DM me on Instagram, you can find me at Shay Leonia. That's ShayLeonia. And I'm happy to continue this conversation with you all.
Okay, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
thank you for taking the time. If you listeners like this podcast episode and you want another episode like this, then please do share with a friend or family member, and we hope to see you next time.
Do you know? Tell me that you will stay. Treat me the right way. Always thought, love it for me, love it for